The learning we're going to do today is a slight detour from our regular Ten Commandments. Not exactly. If you'll remember, one of the ideas we taught about when we were talking about the mitzvah of lo tignov, do not steal, is sort of a theological idea that God gives us whatever we need. And whatever people have, they have, it's from God, and therefore we shouldn't be jealous of them as a result. And that's one of the underlying values of lo tignov. The mitzvot we're going to learn today, there's actually 10 of them. We're going to only touch on them. We're going to try to develop a theme as opposed to individual mitzvot. But the 10 mitzvot we're going to hit upon actually come from the parshiot we just finished, Parshat Bahar primarily, that deals with the mitzvot that have to do with economics coming from the field. Those are mitzvot like Shemitta, and where we cancel debts every 7 years, where we leave the corners of the field, the peah, the shechacha, the lekad, right? You leave it for the poor to come and get. The mitzvah of Yovel, right after 7 Shemitta years, right? 7 times 7, and then in the 50th year we have the Yovel, where everyone returns to their original family inheritance. So on that mitzvah of Yovel, for example, these are mitzvot numbers 326, in case you're counting, 326 to 335. On the mitzvah of Yovel, which is number 330, what is the reason why everyone returns to their original lands, meaning no matter how much land you've acquired or not acquired, everything goes back to the beginning, so to speak. And the Sefer HaChinuch says the reason behind this is that the eternal Lord desired to convey to his people that everything is his, everything is God's, and ultimately everything will return to whomever he wished to give it to originally, because the earth is his, as it is written, the land is mine, from Vayikra 25:23. Then with this precept of counting every year, people will keep away from seizing land of their fellow man by robbery or even desiring in their heart, because they'll know that ultimately it's not theirs anyway, even if they temporarily have control of it. So you see in a sense that Yovel, on some level, is a continuation of the mitzvah of lo tignov that we just learned about in the Ten Commandments. That's the made-up reason why we're learning Yovel, but it makes sense. It makes sense. The real reason I'm embarrassed to say is this was a class that I prepared for Shavuot, because the mitzvot of Shemitta and Yovel and all these type of peah, shechacha, lekad, all these mitzvot that have to do with the field, of course, are very much connected to the book of Ruth and to the theme of Shavuot, and I thought that it might be interesting to sort of look at how the Torah sort of creates the ideal economy based upon these values. So I thought, as long as we're still sort of in the Chol HaMoed, or we're right, if Shavuos was 7 days, like the rest of the Chagim, we'd still be in Shavuos and I could talk about it. So this is my excuse for still talking about it now. I just want to say one more thing before I call on you, which is a lot of what I'm going to be sharing with you today is based upon a number of different articles, and they are actually things that I learned together with Dr. Benny Porat. Benny Porat is the head of the Mishpat Ivri department at the Hebrew University, where I've been learning recently. And so a lot of the ideas are either his ideas or based upon articles that he assigned in his class. Yes.
Do we know what year of Yovel we're holding now?
Oh no, it's a tough question, but I'll tell you what's interesting. I don't have the answer. So, but one thing I'll tell you is when we try to figure out the author and the date of the Sefer HaChinuch, we have to know the Yovel. Why? He actually tells us what number Yovel we're in. He doesn't tell us the year he writes it or anything else. He tells us the Yovel. So we figure out that he's within a 50-year period of time when he wrote this book. But I don't have the answer to your question of where we're holding right now in terms of right. Well, that's part of Yovel is very often a euphemism for Mashiach as well. In other words, we have not had Yovel since we've been exiled from the land, and the way the Rambam understands it, and we spoke about this last week, a great number of mitzvot will become applicable. Once again, it says when Yovel becomes applicable. So when is Yovel? So according to the Rambam and others, that's when all of Am Yisrael has returned. So even if before Mashiach, if everyone has returned, we'll implement Yovel again, and that will actually be sort of a sign that Mashiach is on the way. Yes? Absolutely a connection between that. Absolutely. Okay, so I want to just begin with you can see the title here, From Marx to Madoff, the Jews and Their Economies. What is the ideal economy from a Torah perspective? By the way, I didn't advertise this class because when I did advertise it, I started to send out the announcements to where I was speaking. They said they felt maybe that anti-Semites would pick on this title, From Marx to Madoff, Jews and Their Economies. It sort of plays into certain ideas anti-Semites have about Jews and money. But nevertheless, I put it on the source sheet because I said when I get to my Tikkun Leil, my Shavuos night class at 2 in the morning, there probably aren't so many anti-Semites that are that committed, to come at 2 in the morning and my hope is the same here at the OU Center, that we don't have too many that are, willing to come here. But this title, Marx to Madoff, I'm obviously picking two extremes. And it reminds me of an old joke about the 1930s, these two Jewish guys, they're riding in the subway in New York, and they're reading newspapers, and one of them is reading the Jewish Forward, in Yiddish, and the other one is reading, Henry Ford's Anti-Semitic Rag, which was a newspaper that basically had it out for the Jews. And the Jewish guy who's reading, they're both Jewish, the one who's reading the Forward says to the one who's reading the anti-Semitic paper, says, how could you be reading that junk? I mean, this is terrible. How could you read that? And the other one says, well, look what's in your paper. Your paper, right, it says, the Jews are suffering, the Jews are, this is the Forward, everything that was going on in the Jewish world in those times. The Jews are, becoming refugees. The only way the Jews will get any rights if they form a labor union, and the labor union was just smashed by the powerful entities, all these different things. It's all terrible news. He says, look what's in my paper, the anti-Semitic paper. Jews run the world, Jews have all the money, Jews control everything. He says, I want a little piece of good news once in a while, so I like to read the anti-Semitic paper. Those two extremes, by the way, though, is something that we see throughout our history, that we see very often Jews on, let's say, one end, they're poverty, they're broke, they're the heads of the labor unions trying to squeak out a little bit better economic well-being for the masses. The Jews have very often been the leaders of socialist movements, the communist movements, and the collectivist movements along those lines at one extreme. And then on the other extreme, certainly also many of the greatest capitalists and those pushing for a freer market and less, government regulation have also been Jews. We've been at both ends, and we've been everywhere in between. And so it started getting me thinking, these are what Jews have said the right economy is. What is the Torah perspective? If a Jew read the Torah, how would you think the ideal economy, a Torah economy, should be created? Should it be more collectivist, socialist, what we would say probably focus more on equality, that everyone really gets the same? Or should it be on the other end, which is more focusing on freedom, personal responsibility, individualism, capitalism? That's on the two ends. Which is where does the Torah sort of lean? In the middle. What I'm going to argue is the Torah actually, rather than I argue, we'll actually look at the sources. It could be maybe in the middle. It could be neither. It could be both. And it may depend on the times. So if you look at the very first source is written by Rabbi David Halevi, who's the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv. And he starts off by saying, there are Yeshnam Ke'ele, B'neihem Gam Shalomei Emunei Yisrael. There are people, including people who are believers in Torah and followers of Torah, who think that the Torah doesn't say anything about economics, doesn't say anything about how you should arrange an ideal state. And he says, that's kfira, that's a form of, not obviously idol worship, but it's a form of denial of the Torah. How could you possibly think the Torah that addresses everything in the world and is God's blueprint for life doesn't say anything about creating the ideal economy? Creating the ideal economy, which has such a big impact on all of our lives. How could that's terrible if you say that. However, he says there is a little truth to that, because the Torah doesn't offer a specific vision. Right? On a lot of these sort of big political or big economic issues, the Torah is either silent or ambiguous. For example, even with regards to a king, right? You might say that's the government form that the Torah is recommending. But the Torah is not clear about it. The Torah says, if you end up wanting a king, this is how you do it. But we don't know, are you supposed to have a king? You're not supposed to have a king? There's ambiguity within that, and there's certainly ambiguity in terms of the economic approach. So he admits that there's an ambiguity, and we'll talk a little bit about his reasons of why that ambiguity exists, maybe at the end of the class. But he says as follows. He says, even if it doesn't have a specific economic vision, it does have certain principles that we're supposed to live by. And that's on the second column. The second column, he mentions what are some of these economic principles that we're supposed to live by. And then he says, basically, the parshiot that we just read recently in synagogue of Bahar and Bukuktai and Emor. And he says, these are things like do not lend at interest, all the mitzvot of the field, which, by the way, he includes also Shabbat as part of that process, but certainly Peah, where you leave the corners of your field for the poor and the widow and the orphan, the ger who need additional assistance, the mitzvah of Shemitta, which we just spoke about, which would cancel debts every 7 years, but also Meiser, all the types of tithing. He would also talk about Shemitta, by the way, not just dealing with loans, but also dealing with slaves, that basically you try to not allow people to continue, you set them free on the Shemitta year. And if they choose to nevertheless become permanent slaves, that permanent slavery cannot exist forever, right? That's the Yovel, the Jubilee year. Every 50 years, all the slaves are completely set free. And if during the interim years they had to sell their land, right? They couldn't afford to maintain their land, and therefore they had to sell their properties, and they weren't able to redeem it previously. Doesn't matter, the 50th year, it returns to the original owners. It's kind of like, any of you live on church land here in Jerusalem today, right? So the lease comes up, and it's going to go back to the church lands. So here, the government, this building, oh, okay.
You're not supposed to have idol worshippers in Israel. Christianity is an idolatry. They shouldn't be here.
Well, that's
They
another,
shouldn't own property. They're not allowed to be here at all.
that's another question, but you missed last,
Idol worshippers.
you missed the last year. You'll have to look at the video. I actually spoke about this exact topic last week, so look at it, and I speak very extensive.
Christianity, idolatry?
I speak about that
They're not
topic.
allowed to be here.
I speak about that topic. Okay, we're going to move on, though. Because this is a side point. The point that, of course, that I'm trying to make is that according to Rabbi David Halevi, the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, we don't have a specific system, but we have specific values. Now, the question is, what do those values represent? Yes?
It doesn't, you see in Pirkei Avos, it says, somewhere, that it says that you'll never totally get rid of the poor.
That's true.
That is a statement that all these egalitarian, idealistic, communistic ideas are not going to work.
So we're going to look at all those statements, okay? In fact, I'm going to conclude with that idea, actually, about that the poor will never be gone from the land. What does that mean? And what type of economic system? So thanks for raising it. Okay, so I introduced a bunch of those different ideas. If you want, the next page, if you flip the page, are where some of these mitzvot appear in the Torah in terms of their original sources. Some of them appear 2 or 3 different times. We don't need to actually look at the sources, but you can see that they all exist. They're all the right to level mitzvot. The question is, what are they? Is something like Peah, is something like the Jubilee year, Shemitta, is it more collectivist, more focusing on equality, or is it more capitalistic, more focusing on freedom and individualism? So if you go to the next page, right, we flew through that second page relatively quickly, you'll see I have a chart on number 4. Socialist or capitalist, collectivist or individualist, equality or freedom. So the left-hand side, you see where it says anchored in law? So the left-hand side, those 3 ideas, I would say argue for sort of socialism or collectivist approach in terms of economics. So for example, the first idea, anchored in law. What does that mean? So if you look through the other ancient legal systems, many of them mention the concept of, for example, the cancellation of debt. Something very similar to Shemitta, or complete letting go of slaves, like Shemitta, or even in a Yovel. So what's the difference? Is this something that's simply copied from existing Hammurabi's code, or in Egypt, or the like? And the truth is, there is a parallel, but there's also a very significant difference. The biggest difference is that the Shemitta rules are established in law, they don't change, and they're constant. Every 7 years, they're going to come, the debt's going to be canceled, and you can count on it. You could set your watch by it. When it exists in the other societies, it's based purely on the whim of the king. Very often, a king would come to power, and one of the ways to sort of consolidate power is to grant a cancellation of the debt of those people who are most likely to support him. Right? He'd come forward and say, your debts are now canceled, and of course, this is one of the ways he would ingratiate himself with the new people that he's now just become rulers of. And that may be it. He may never do it again in the course of his kingship or his lifetime, or he may do it. We have a couple of examples where in times of rebellion, the king would do it a second time or a third time. Sometimes there'd be a gap of 20 years or 30 years, and sometimes there'd be a gap of 2 or 3 years because he was basically like almost a modern day politician, ingratiating himself with those who needed. So it was based upon the king's whim, as opposed to established in law. The parallel, if you want to think about it, is the difference between constitutional law and, let's say, Knesset or a parliament's legislation. Right? Legislation can change every year. Every year you can pass something new. There's no guarantee if a law passed today will be the law next year. We're building a building not far from here, and when we started the building, this is sort of just an incidental point, the size of your entranceways, because it's also for a nursery school, were supposed to be 1 meter, 20 centimeters wide. So we built doors with 1 meter, 20 centimeters wide. However, that's when we started the building a year ago. Now, we're getting ready to finish the building, and we've asked for the fire inspector to come forward, and he told us, by the way, the law has changed. It's now 1 meter, 30 centimeters. I said, but, this is a building literally built in stone. What do you want me to do? We're now 10 centimeters short. The law has changed. So that's a legislation. A constitution, however, is something that's permanent, that's not going to change. So the king changing his mind from day to day is legislation that can always change. When it's constitutional, that means it's a right. That means the poor could rely on this. It was not going to be taken away from them. It was part of their basket of rights, so to speak, that every 7 years there was going to be cancellation of debts, and so therefore that's a sign that this is sort of more of a protectionist or a collectivist or socialist focusing on equality of those people. Okay, another example, responsibility between people. In those ancient societies, very often, who gave the gift to the people, or who paid for it? It was the king. Who pays for it? Who pays for taking care of the poor in Jewish society? It was not the king. It was not the government. It was their fellow farmer. The farmer who owns the field has to leave his corners, or his meiser, his tithing, right? It wasn't the government's responsibility. It was the other individual where you took, in a sense, from the rich, and you gave to the poor. So again, you see it as sort of a more of a socialistic, collectivist point of view. By the way, I just want to go back to the first point for a second. We actually have a source in the Torah that suggests that kings sometimes, on certain days, would do something kind as a way of ingratiating themselves with others. Where does that appear? Does anyone know? With Paro, right? Paro releases prisoners on his birthday. The Torah says it was his birthday, and then he decided to release prisoners. So we see that it was part of the custom that kings would do certain things in honor of their birthdays, or when they became inaugurated, or things along those lines. Clemency, yes. By the way, you don't see that same clemency in the Jewish law, right? The clemency is for if you're a slave or for a debt, but not if you're a prisoner, meaning it wasn't a political motivation to release prisoners. It was an economic incentive, right, in the Torah. So you see that's a form of taxation, the second idea, taxation on the rich to cover for the poor. So you might say it's a little bit more socialist in this regard. The third example is that it's interested in sustaining the poor and their rehabilitation. What does it mean, sustaining the poor? Well, the payah, right? It wasn't a ton of, the person didn't get rich off of payah. But they were able to survive, right? If they were starving, they could get their food from payah or shikaka, things along those lines. But the Torah goes a step further, right? It's not just about the bare minimum. It actually is trying to elevate the poor, to save them even from their poverty. When you cancel debts, right, that's about rehabilitation. That's not just giving a person a fish. That's really trying to teach them how to fish, so to speak, right? It's start over. And certainly the Jubilee year, you have your land, you've lost it for whatever reason, and now you're able to get it back, start over, right? This is definitely a concept of rehabilitation, definitely sort of a leveling of the playing field, you might say, arguing for a socialist point of view. So that's one side of the equation. The other side of the equation, however, I would say is the exact opposite. The other side suggests for a sort of capitalist understanding of everything we've just said. So look at the first source. Responsibility of the individual, the recipient of the aid. This is not welfare, right? Where you get mailed a check to your house. The people did not pack up a gift and then bring it to the poor. You had to work for it. You had to go out to the fields. And by the way, it wasn't easy work, right? You see this with Ruth, right? It was hard work. You had to go out and harvest. You had to actually work for this sustenance. In a sense, you had to take a certain amount of responsibility. The clearest case of that, of course, is with regards to a loan. If you look in the Torah talks about we should not be stingy with the poor, right? Don't close your hand, but rather open up your hand and give to the poor in your community. The context of that is as a loan. The whole concept of tzedakah, which is a big part of our lives today, of giving money to the poor, doesn't exist in the Torah. The closest we get maybe is with the tithe for the poor, but that wasn't every year, right? That was only every few years. And even that was a tithe of food, and it's not the same of giving tzedakah. The rabbis actually had to almost invent the concept of tzedakah when we no longer had land, when we no longer had an agricultural society. We're living in Babylonia. So then they had to say, how can we take care of the poor amongst us? And they came up with the idea of tzedakah, which doesn't exist in the Torah itself. The Torah itself is doing a loan. What the rabbis did is they sort of pull a fast one on us. They say, the Torah says you should give a loan, but not at interest. And the rabbis say, well, ideally you should give them money, tzedakah, but if they'll be embarrassed to take the money, tell it's a loan. Because the Torah says give them a loan, doesn't say give them money. So the rabbis say the Torah is expecting that a person might be embarrassed, so call it a loan, but really it's a gift if they never pay you back. Yeah. It says tithe, right? Tithe your produce. Right? That's if you have land. So it's true, we learn it from that, and the rabbis also learn the concept, the 10%, because we would give the corners of our fields or tithing but that particular tithe, that's a metaphor almost. That's a model. Who are you giving that 10% to? No, you weren't giving to the poor. You were giving to the Kohanim. Are you giving to the Levim, to the Kohanim? By the way, that's the one example where we actually did give as a gift. But there, the Kohanim were actually working for it, right? They were doing a job, and in a sense, we are paying them for it, which is also part of sort of a capitalist model. If you do a job, you deserve to get paid for it. So that it's true, we learn the concept of our 10% tithing from that. But if you look at the actual case, it's not parallel, or it's not the same, I should say. It is parallel, but it's not the same as our tzedakah today. So there was a great deal of responsibility of a recipient. If you want to benefit from this system, you have to go out and work for yourself. As I say, the loan is the ideal form of sustenance, of assistance, and there you have to pay it back, right? So you see that as well. The other thing, and this is a point that she had made, the class stratification remains. In other words, we try to help out the poor, but we're not about making everyone totally equal. Think of the Jubilee year for just a moment. The way many people understand the Jubilee year is as an incredibly powerful socialist vision. Every 50 years, everyone is totally equal again. But that's not true, right? Everyone is not equal again. Because what's actually returned in the Jubilee year? Only land, but not all land. Right, if you're in a walled city, right, you don't return anything. The land that was agricultural is returned to the original owners because that was able to create the wealth, let's say, right, the farming and the like. But if, for example, in the intervening 50 years, you acquired a lot of wealth and you bought cattle and you bought, you put your money in gold or Bitcoin or something else, and you moved, your properties into a walled cities, you didn't have to return any of that. So you were able to keep your wealth, but you had to return some of it. So it's not entirely a total leveling of the playing field, because there would still be wealthy people, but there would be, maybe you'd say there's a protection at the bottom. And you see the fact that we had still wealthy people, and the Torah is not necessarily even against that. When it describes Abraham and Yitzchak and Yaakov, they're very often described as wealthy people acquiring great wealth, and it's not viewed in the negative. And what's the perfect case? What's the perfect line that we have in the Torah that shows us that the Torah is not against sort of different classifications in terms of economics? Is right. So there again, we came out. It wasn't viewed as a negative thing, although there is a danger in that leaving Egypt, because presumably we all left with the same wealth, right? However, when we get to Israel, God and Reuven, they say, wait a second, we need more land because we have cattle. So why did they have more cattle if everyone left with the same amount? And one of the commentaries, I think it's the Kli Yakar there, says, no, they had the same amount, but they just invested more sort of emotional energy into what they had, meaning they were more consumed by looking at their wealth. But you're right, that in itself is not looked as negative. Right, we have examples of that. We have Avram, we have the judges, we have the like. I would say one other thing, we have one of the 10 commandments, lo tachmod. Don't be jealous, right? If someone else, have I mentioned this point already about the real definition of sameach b'chalko? Okay, it's one of my favorite divrei Torah. I learned it, let me finish this. I learned it in while I was in a taxi cab when I first moved to Israel. The Torah, the Pirkei Avot says, Ezehu Asher, who is the wealthy person? Hasamech b'chalko, the one who's happy in his lot. So I was listening, I sat in a taxi, and the taxi driver lowered this was on the radio, and I said, now I know I want to really be in Israel. They're playing Pirkei Avot on the radio. Isn't that wonderful? And the taxi driver lowered the sound. He says, and this is why I really knew for sure I wanted to be in Israel, because then the taxi driver told me that here's the right interpretation of Pirkei Avot. He lowers the sound. He says, it's not what you think it means. You think it means the wealthy person is the person who is satisfied with whatever he has. He says, no, that's not what Samech B'chalko means. Ezehu Asher, who is wealthy? Hasamech B'chalko, the person who is happy in his lot, meaning your neighbor's lot. If your neighbor all of a sudden gets a brand new car, or gets a brand new house, or gets a brand new job, and you're Samech, you're happy that he's being successful, that's a truly wealthy person who can not be jealous of the other. So the Torah tells us, lo tachmod, don't be jealous. The whole essence of, let's say, Marxism, that you want to sort of create class warfare, is that the classes should look at one another with suspicion, that the poor should look at the wealthy and say, this is unfair, and let's have a revolution, let's change everything. Torah doesn't say that at all. In fact, the opposite is lo tachmod. Don't look at the other. Don't be jealous. And there will be always these different classifications, and you see it, in fact, with actually the Jubilee year. There still were wealthy people. It didn't equalize everything. There wasn't a total equality. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned before walled cities. What about Jericho? Let's say today.
Okay, I'm not going to talk about. Wait, excuse me, sir. I'm not going to talk about Jericho now because I want to make sure to cover the.
You mentioned walled cities before.
I understand, for the purpose of economic reasons. For the purpose of economic reasons. Now, let me say one more thing about this. There's an article, which is a fascinating article. It's called Land Concentration, Efficiency, Slavery, and the Jubilee, written by Jacob Rosenberg and Avi Weiss. And they talk about what was the purpose of the Jubilee year. And we spoke about this once before a little bit. They explain that all of these economic ideas, don't take interest when you lend, Shemitta, Jubilee, they're all connected to two things. One is preventing monopolies, and two is preventing slavery. They were not about making everyone equal, but they are about protecting a society from inefficiencies like a monopoly, or even worse, slavery, which of course Judaism is terribly against. How do you see this? So he says, what would normally happen in the development of civilization? So everyone's a farmer. Everyone has their land. Then all of a sudden comes a drought, and you don't produce any crops. and now you're in big trouble. The next year you have no crops, you therefore can't sell anything, you don't have enough money to buy the seeds. So what do? You take a loan to buy the seeds to plant for the things. Well, what happens, first of all, if there's another drought? So now you again don't have any money. You've already taken a loan, and the loans in those days could be 25%, 50%. You can't pay back your loan. So after a few years, what do you end up having to do? You end up having to sell your land. That's the only asset. Well, first you sell your cattle, you sell whatever else you have, then you sell your land. That's the only thing you have. And then eventually you work for the person who's bought your land. That person controls all the wages, right? Because they've collected more and more and more land. They've created a monopoly, so they can control the wages that they're going to pay. And eventually, you have to sell yourself into slavery. What they suggest, the whole concept of this system of the mitzvah of rebit, of not taking interest, of Shemitta and Yovel, is to protect against, first of all, one person acquiring all the land, right? Every 50 years, he has to give up his farmland. It's not about him giving up all his wealth, but for him, whatever controls creation, right? Whatever allows the means of economic creation, which is farmland in those days. So he has to give that up, so he can't, develop and have total control. He says monopolies are very inefficient, and also to avoid slavery. You get a loan without interest, so hopefully you can pay it back. There's less of that pressure. If you can't pay it back, the loan itself is canceled every 7 years. If you still can't pay it back, and you have to sell yourself into slavery, you're released every 7 years. And you know what? If you still can't pay it back, you can't get yourself out of slavery, you have at least every 50 years, you know what? You're going to be able to get one more chance to get back and start all over. So the idea was not that the Torah is about creating a total equality, but it's avoiding a total disaster. Right? That's very different. Those are two very, very different ideas. By and large, the Torah is not interested in getting involved in picking winners and losers in the economy. It just wanted to make sure that there was no slavery. That's different, by the way. That's this last point here. The correction of the free market, not its cancellation. Zev Jabotinsky actually wrote about economics a lot. And Zev Jabotinsky wrote about the Jubilee year, and he says, if I were a king, I would make the Jubilee year a big part of my economic platform. He says, but it's not about, some people have this image of, if you look at a forest and over 50 years' time, some trees will be taller and some trees will be shorter, and you just come along and cut them all down so they're all equal. That's how many people understand Jubilee. He says, that's not what it is. He says, what the Jubilee year is if there's a boxing match, without a referee, sometimes it's unfair, and if a guy falls down, one guy will really beat him down. The referee comes in, and that's what the Jubilee year is, to keep it fair. To send you back to your corners, give you a rest, make sure that things are much more fair. It's not about canceling the capitalist system, but making sure that it doesn't take advantage of the weakest in society, and making sure that there's a certain amount of fairness. And it's not really getting involved in the details of what the economy should look like. Therefore, one of the sources I brought, for example, is from Hammurabi's Code. Safety net, yeah. We're going back just a little bit. Let's see if I can find. Oh, it's just right above that chart. You see number 3, Hammurabi's laws. You see, for example, there, the first couple actually talk about, these are all measurements in economic measurements. They tell you how much something is worth. The melech b'kofer, how much is that worth, the salt, or per person? Shnei shkalim kesef sichru yiten. It's price fixing, meaning in Hammurabi's Code, they actually tell you what is the price. The next one also says something similar, is what is the price of a certain item? What is the hourly wage that you should pay a certain person? Right? The Torah is not involved, doesn't get involved in setting these prices. It lets the market do its thing unless it becomes wildly unfair, and then it steps in. And that's what the laws of rebit and Shemitta and Jubilee are really all about, to keep things in a fair process. So here you now see, I should add one more point about sort of the capitalist side. Shemitta is incredibly beautiful. Jubilee is incredibly beautiful. But you know what? It's not every year. What makes Jubilee so powerful is that it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. So on one hand, it is a very socialist idea. Wow, we're going to start over. On the other hand, it's once in a lifetime, literally. Once in your lifetime, you'll have this chance. So it's not about having the society always be equal, but it is about giving a chance in case things become too wildly unfair in one direction. Okay. So hopefully what you see here is that these laws, I don't know if it's in the middle. I think they sometimes yes this way, sometimes yes that way. It's a little bit of both. The question is that the best we can hope for? Is that we have these values and we just sort of have to implement the values as much as possible, but we don't have a coherent system of actually how to develop an economy. By the way, that may be the answer. The first source, Rabbi David Halevi, in the second column, in this the first page. So he writes, if you remember, we had spoken about how he says the Torah absolutely has an opinion, but it doesn't always specifically say what that opinion is. It leaves it a little bit ambiguous. And then it gives you two reasons why, Aleph and Bet, right there. And one of the things it says, the first answer is that the Fimehu Tam Shal Shitrei Chaim Ele, according to the essence of the fields of these fields of life, meaning economics and the likes, the needs sometimes change from time to time. In other words, sometimes a society might need a little bit more laissez-faire, and sometimes the Torah might need actually a little bit more socialism, might need a little bit more protection. Things change, and he says the Torah wants to be flexible in that. And you know what? And some societies will work better in this direction, and some societies will work better in this direction. And so he says the Torah doesn't give us one answer, because you know what? There is no one answer. Each society might need a slightly different way based upon its own history and its own culture and traditions and things along those lines. And the rabbis were aware of that, certainly. Like, we had an agricultural society. Well, today, if we're not a purely agricultural society, the economy changes. What then do you end up doing? So in Bet, he says, Lo ratzta Torah lekof et ha'am linhog b'chayav hachiloniim al pi mishtar mesoyamim. So the Torah did not want to force the nation to behave on secular matters in a particular fashion, but rather but rather left the choice, the ritzono hachofshi, but rather left it up to free choice of the people get together and say, how can we make this system work? With the conditions I've already spoken about, but it's not getting involved in a very specific economic form. So that's one answer you could say. The Torah doesn't have a specific economic vision at all, just these basic principles. What I'd like to suggest, however, is there is, on some level, a coherent way of producing the economy in a Jewish state that includes these values, and there is sort of an overriding principle that should be applied across the board. Just before I do so, do you have a question?
Yeah, do children inherit the debt?
Do the children inherit?
For the next 50 years.
No, well, they very often do, but they still accept that they can then get back to their land. The Yovel is a bright line, yeah. Okay, so I want to just tell you 3 quick stories, and hopefully this will help us get the answer. The first story is, I think I mentioned this once before. I was trying to get out of a narrow street near Emek Rafaim, and I was trying to pull out, and this other car was trying to pull in, and I mentioned that this is a great opportunity for us to learn about the halachot of, the camel, which one camel is burdened more than the other, or the ship, if they both come to the exact same point at the same time, which goes first based upon which is more burdened, which is less burdened. And so here I thought was a good opportunity for us to learn some Gemara, as both my car and this car were trying to get past one another, but it was too narrow of a lane to actually go through. And so, I rolled down my window. I thought maybe we'd have a discussion about the Gemara, about who should go first. And he rolled down his window, and he said, Achi, my brother. And then he told me a Gemara I was not familiar with at a very high decibel, which let's just say he was not as thrilled to learn Gemara as I was at this point in time. We eventually worked it out, but that experience, I think, actually sheds light on an important principle, which I'll mention in just a moment. The second story is a book that I'm reading. It's called The Geography of Bliss. It's about how different places, bliss, how different places either produce or reduce happiness of its people based upon certain ideas. And the author concludes by saying he thinks he has found that which makes some places happier than others. And what he concludes is that they have to do with relationships, those societies that encourage relationships. He gives an example of in Bhutan. Bhutan is a small country near Nepal that actually has something called the GHP, Gross Happiness Product. Instead of gross domestic product, gross happiness product. And there's a minister, and his job is not to look at how they're doing economically, but are people actually happier? And so he goes to this country and he tries to figure out what makes these people happy or not happy. And he's actually driving along to the capital city, and their road is actually very narrow in the capital city in the mountains. And he comes with another car confronting, and they have to all get out of their car and they have to sort of, cooperate to get past. And he says, isn't this amazing? He says, everything they do is about cooperation. They grow their crops, they cooperate. And he says, one of the things we've lost in modern society is perhaps the inability to compromise as much as we had perhaps in other times. If you get in a car, today I was driving with my son, he wanted the air conditioning on one level, and I wanted the air conditioning on another level, right? At home, you can have different things. Listen, you can also have mattresses that one is a little bit firmer, everything could be specifically for what your interests and needs are. And the question is, if we lose the ability to compromise on some of these smaller things, do we also lose the ability to compromise on larger things? So he says that's one of the conclusions he sees in a lot of different societies that seem to be happy. For example, Iceland is a country that actually is always ranked as one of the happiest countries. And he visits there and he can't understand why they would be happy in Iceland. Iceland is freezing. It's cold. It's dark most of the year. There's all these things. So he tries to do research. One of the answers he comes up with actually is that every weekend they all get drunk. It's a very high, they have a very high drinking level in Iceland, and people say that's one of the reasons why they're happy. And he asks them, he says, why do you actually, maybe Gab warms up. They actually say something else. They say something very different. Iceland's actually a small country. It's only 300,000 people. And the people say, especially the young people, want to meet new people. But the problem is they already know everyone, right, in the whole city. So they say, though, when they get drunk, it's like meeting new people because they forget, so they go to a party and they're like, oh, I haven't met you before. And so it's a way of sort of meeting new people. It reminds me, by the way, it sounds like, it actually, believe it or not, Judaism has a parallel, although I think hopefully slightly more meaningful way of understanding it, which is with regards to Sheva Brachot. Sheva Brachot, you always have to have a new face, right? Panim Chadashot. What's the exception? When don't you need Panim Chadashot? Shabbos, you don't need Panim Chadashot. You don't need a new face at the Sheva Bracha. So why don't you need it? So there's all these different technical reasons, but the Hasidim, I think, have the best answer. They say, on Shabbat, we're all different than who we were yesterday. We're totally different people. If you sort of so you're the Panim Chadashot, meaning everyone is a totally new person who looks different or feels different on Shabbat, so you don't need it. So to me, that's the parallel of Iceland. We're like new people on Shabbat, not because, God forbid we get drunk, but because we actually experience Shabbat and we feel different as a result. He does a little more research and says maybe there's another reason too, and it has to actually do with that it's freezing cold. Because it's so cold, there's a tremendous need to cooperate. Again, growing crops together. You would die if you didn't rely on your neighbor and your neighbor rely on you. There's a tremendous amount of reliance, and what's interesting is in countries that you think of being totally idealistic happy, like sort of the Caribbean or the island, on the equator, where everything is, none of them make it into the top 10 in terms of happiness. because they're perhaps a little bit too individualistic. So he says that, and he shows the opposite. He shows how there's less happiness in other places. For example, he looks at Qatar. Qatar is this incredible, it used to be a relatively poor society, and then became super wealthy overnight. And everyone is tremendously wealthy, and yet he goes around and asks people, and they're not necessarily super happy. He actually asked them at a Starbucks, which is interesting. He goes into a Starbucks in the middle of the day. He thought he would do some work, and it's 3 o'clock, and the place is packed. And he says, why is it so packed? Don't any of you have to work? And they all say, yeah, we're all working right now. You see, we're so wealthy, we actually hire people to do the jobs we're hired for. So we're working now, but their payment from the government is greater than their salary. So they just take it and they pay people to do their job. So he said, but they're not necessarily happy. And he digs a little bit deeper, and some of the people start talking about, when they were poor, they used to have their tents and their communal tents, and larger families would all be together, and they would do things sort of communally, and they would go to the mosque all together, and there was a lot of interaction. He says, now, everything that was done communally, we're so wealthy, we do it inside our own home, right? There's no need to go out for, I'll talk superficial things. There's no need to go out for a movie because you have your own personal theater, or to the gym because you have your own gym. For your pool, everything is inside. So you have no need to connect with others. And there's a professor at Hebrew University said something very fascinating the other day. He was talking about the Mishnaic villages. Our Chatzer in the Mishnah, in Bava Kama, for example. The Chatzer, the courtyard, is the middle place where all these homes were on the Chatzer. And all the times we're introduced to the concept of the Chatzer, the courtyard, we're usually introduced for some other law, like a law related to Shabbat, a law related to Erevin, like, does this count as an Erev or not? And he says, the most important thing about each time we learn about this, and we always miss it, is look at the lifestyle of the people as they live in a Chatzer. What took place in the Chatzer? Everything. Right? They did their joint cooking together. They did their laundry together. The kids played together. Now, on one hand, maybe it's a little bit nicer to have your own place to do cooking, so you don't have everyone, yelling at one another. I remember when we first moved to Nachlaot, and we didn't have a balcony, so we built our sukkah on the street. And Nachlaot is right on top of you. Everyone's on top of you. And I remember every hammer, and every nail I put into my sukkah, someone from one of the other balconies looking down at me said, no, you're doing it wrong. You're doing it wrong. Put it there, put it there. They were involved in everything because it was a joint communal chatzer. So there are downsides, but there's also something very powerfully communal about that. And they felt in Qatar, they were missing that. So there is this potential idea of relationships. The more you have the relationships, the happier potentially you will be. And now the last story I want to tell you, which is my son, who's 8 years old, was talking to me about Anim Zmirot. And he says, Anim Zmirot. And he says, I don't understand something, right? One of the lines is, Shirim Arog. Songs that, now for him, he says, it sounds to him like they're saying, Shirim Arog, songs that I'm going to kill. He says, why would you kill a song? And I said, no, that's not what it says. Let's look at it. It says arog, which was with an olive. That means to weave. Songs that I will weave, And he says, what's weave? And I explained to him, it's kind of like knitting a kippah or, weaving. So he says, well, you can't weave songs. And I says, no, you can weave them. It's a metaphor, right? It doesn't mean you literally weave it. He couldn't understand the concept of metaphor. It didn't make sense to him. But we understand the concept of metaphor. And metaphor is actually a big part of our lives. The language we use very often describes the societies we live in. For example, Western society, the concept of time. How does it describe time? Time is money, right? And we use the language all the time to reinforce that idea. We say, I save time, or I invest time, right? But that, by the way, is a very unique Western perspective on time. It's not an Eastern perspective. It's not a Jewish perspective. Time is cyclical. Time is related to a whole series. It's spiritual. Time, Shabbat time. It's totally different. but that says a lot. It sort of reflects what that society, certain elements of that society. So the words we use can very often describe the society behind it. For example, if you describe a society as a body, that means that's a very united, right? Because a body, even if your arm and your leg are different, they're still part of the same body. If you describe a society as a flock of sheep, that suggests sort of a certain passivity. The words we use are very significant, which leads me now to the last set of sources, the last couple of pages.
To a newer search in time is brain.
What?
To a newer search in time is brain.
Time is brain, yeah. So number 5. What I put for number 5 is just a small number of sources that use the exact same word again and again and again and again. Number 5 is right below the chart. It says language and metaphor. So for example, in Shemot, when Moshe goes out, he goes out into society and he looks to find his echav, his brothers. And he saves his brothers the Egyptians who killed his brother. If you look in Vayikra, the very next source, Lo tisna et achicha, don't hate your brother in your heart. Right? It's a mitzvah, by the way, it's a machloket between the Rambam and the Rambam. What does it mean, don't hate your brother in your heart? Don't hate your brother in your heart means, one says, you're not allowed to hate. The other says, I think it's a Ramban, no, it's not that you're not allowed to hate. You're just not allowed to hate your brother in your heart. In other words, get it out. Tell the person that you hate them, and then you've done a mitzvah because it's no longer in your heart. You have to be, out there. But either way, the bigger question is, what does it mean, lo tisna et achicha? What? Hating your brother? Right? It should say, lo tisna et your enemy. What does it mean, don't hate your brother? So if you look the source below it, it says, when you use that language, when the Torah uses that language, it's saying, it's sort of putting in the back of your mind. Even if there's a moment when you hate this person, remember that they're your brother. So at the right time, when they no longer, are doing the thing that causes you to hate them, instantly you can have a close relationship with them once again. The backside. The backside gives a number of different examples. You spoke about the judge who had to be wealthy. So the judge is called, though, nevertheless, he's supposed to be different than us, but he's also called Achicha. The king is called. You can only have a king from amongst Achicha, your brothers. The Navi is called amongst your brothers, meaning these are leaders, as far distant as they may be, nevertheless, they are part of you. They are your brother. And all these sources say the exact same thing again and again and again. It always is your brother. And if you look down, for example, 1, 2, 3, 4 sources down, 5 sources down from the bottom, it says, when there is a poor amongst your brothers, that is in one of your gates, right? You should help him out. And you'll see the Yalkut Shimoni, the Midrash, right below it says, Re'eh et ktiv lo ta'ametz et levavcha me'echecha ha'evyon. It's written, don't be stingy with your heart with your brother who is poor. 1, 2, Yalkut Shimoni, exactly. It doesn't say, me'oni ein kativ. It doesn't say from amongst the poor. It doesn't say, don't give money to the poor. It says, don't be stingy with your brother, right? It could have used the language very easily. If there's poor in your land, help them out. It doesn't say that. It says, when your brother is poor, meaning the focus, the noun, is the brother. It's trying to formulate a cohesiveness within the community. Whether the person is different from you because they're poor, different from you because they're rich, whether they're the king, the shofet, the judge, doesn't matter. Everyone is related, and what we're really looking at is a family. That's what the Torah hits again and again and again. By the way, the word for nation in Hebrew is umah, aleph vav mem hey, and what is the root of umah? Em, mother. Meaning a nation is someone who has the same mother. That's what's taking place here, is that it's trying to emphasize that point. The lady back here had mentioned the question, the statement where it says, there will always be poor in your land. How do we deal with that? So I just want to end with that, and I'll then try to connect everything together. There's a famous midrash between Tarnifus Rufus and Rabbi Akiva. There's a conversation. The conversation goes something like this. The Roman general says to Rabbi Akiva, if God loves you so much, why are there poor in your land? If God loved you, there would be no poor because he would have taken care of all the poor. So Rabbi Akiva responds and says, no, there's always going to be poor, but it's for our benefit. So we can at least get the mitzvah of helping out the poor. So Tarnifus Rufus, however, doesn't give up. He says, wait a second, that proves my point even more so, that there's a problem. What's the problem? And he gives the following mashal, the following analogy. He says, if there was a king, and the king put his servant in prison and said to everyone else in the kingdom, do not pay this person. Do not feed this person. Do not get into the prison and feed him. I want him to suffer. If someone then broke in and gave this person food, the servant food, the king would be furious. So that's what you're doing. God has, in a sense, declared that these poor people are being punished, let's say, according to Tarnifus Rufus. So you now sneaking in and giving that person food is a violation of God's will. So Rabbi Akiva responds to him and says, no, you have the wrong analogy. What's the right analogy? The king says to his son, I'm upset with you, and he puts the son in prison, and he then tells all the people and says, do not feed my son who's in prison, I'm punishing him. And if someone sneaks in and feeds the son, nevertheless, the king has a hard time punishing the person who sneaks in. The king secretly appreciates that the person doesn't listen to him. And he says that's the right analogy. So once you say that the king is also your parent, what does that mean, therefore, about your relationship to everyone else in the community? You're his brother, right? It's a familial relationship. And so what I think that Rabbi David Halevi is ultimately getting at, he says, these mitzvot don't suggest a socialist or a capitalist. Different times will call for different needs. Different countries will call for different needs. The overriding or coherent economic principle, however, what we learn from that is, how do you look at people in the Jewish state? If you look at them as part of your family, right? In a family, very often there's some family members that are more successful and some are less successful. But when you're part of a family, you're always going to help out. Now, you're not going to just have total equality in the family, right? But you're always going to make sure that none of your siblings are starving. You're always going to, if you have an opportunity to help one of your siblings to get a job, you're going to always help that person out. In other words, there's a sense of responsibility you have to people in your family, even though you're not talking necessarily about equality, but you are talking about concern and responsibility. That's the ideal economic vision, is to use these principles to not for economic means, but for spiritual means. The spiritual mean is, how do you look at other people in your society? And every time you fulfill the mitzvah Peah and Shechicha and Yovel and Shemitta, it's really not just about hopefully making the economy more just, it's actually about making the society more united. That's the ultimate goal in this economic vision. Have a good week.